Hello, everyone. To our friends far and wide, glad you could join us today. We are recording from the Plainfield Christian Science Church Independent, Plainfield, New Jersey, in the United States of America for our roundtable discussion on probation after death. And we will begin with our morning prayer.
I'm reading from pages 194 and 195 of Divinity Course in General Collectania. It excerpts from there. Contradict the evidence of the senses all the time in all ways. Be willing to surrender all affection, all worship that is merely personal. Do not make the mistake of refusing to admit the belief of error. There is a belief, a strong one, and it must be met and denied. Flee from it, and it will follow faster than ever. Suffering is the gospel that will bring man to a knowledge of his real state. Better to have pain than pleasure. The greater the pain, the nearer its own overthrow. We should not wait for perfection in our work before demonstration. There would be to admit the reality, that would be to admit the reality of imperfection, the very thing we are trying to overthrow. Probation, progress, goes on until there is no life, substance, or intelligence in matter. Mary Baker Eddy.
Thank you. That's beautiful. I never noticed that before. Real estate. It's our real estate. Okay. We will go on to our watching point.
Watch number 370. Watch in dealing with patients and with yourself that you remember Mrs. Eddy's definition of sin. Once a student tied himself up in the dilemma of believing that he was being punished for sin because he was sick, since this is what Science and Health declares. This tied him up because he looked himself over and could find no sin. According to Mrs. Eddy, yielding to the mesmerism of mortal belief in any form is sin. On page 428 of the textbook we read, quote, "It is sin to believe that aught can overpower omnipotent and eternal life," end quote. In the 16th edition it reads, quote, "I account it sinful and idolatrous to have more faith in drugs, diet, air, exercise, cleanliness, than in God, truth, and love, to keep the body harmonious and make man undying," end quote. Mrs. Eddy once wrote, quote, "What is a good dinner or a good meal? Good devil. What is a good night's sleep? Good evil. What is a nice new dress? Good evil. What is a sense of health and matter? Good evil. Which is nearer God, a human sense of health or of sickness?" End quote. When flowers are cut, they soon fade. The belief that man has any existence apart from God is sin that leads first to sickness and then to death. It is a sin to believe in matter or mortal mind. It is a sin to believe in a finite origin for man or to yield to animal magnetism.
All right. Comments?
Well, I thought about that question, which is nearer God, a human sense of health or of sickness? And then I realized that in health, we don't really seek God that much or think that we need to stay close to God. But when we're not feeling well, we don't like it. So we do turn to God more and to feel his closeness in order to overcome the belief in disease or whatever it is we're going through. And in those other questions, that's answered also in Kratzer's book. I can't remember the chapter now, but where he talked about it not too long ago in the Roundtable, where he says that how to look at food and clothing, and if we're looking at it from a human standpoint, that's material-based thinking, and we have to lift it out of the matter into the spiritual sense of it.
Thank you.
Yeah, I guess this helps explain why Mrs. Eddy wrote, it's easier to heal people of sickness than it is to heal them of sin, right?
Yes.
Because this watching point kind of covers the whole ground. I mean, it's sin to believe that there is any life, truth, intelligence, or substance, or anything good in matter.
It's interesting, the man who thinks that he had no sin. I mean, I'm sure at the time he was still, having such belief in good food or good and nice dress, or it's the human sense of it all. I'm sure that persists for some time, persisting with me.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I mean, I can remember feeling that way a long time ago, but I didn't know what I was doing wrong. And mainly, the 10 Commandments. I thought I was obeying the 10 Commandments, and I'm sure the Sermon on the Mount, but it wasn't until later that I realized all these other things were sins. And certainly negativity, as I've mentioned, to be fearful, negative. Those are sins because you're believing that there's a power other than God. And that's always the test. And it says, Mrs. Eddy, quoting Mrs. Eddy, I account it sinful and idolatrous to have more faith in these things, and lists all those things. And when you have more faith in them, you have
Made a God.
You've made a God.
That's
The key.
Isn't it just about translating these things? Because there's nothing wrong with them as expressions of God. So it's just about translating the beautiful home back to security and beauty and form and all the things that God made.
It's tying it to the source, right? One source, God.
Yes.
All of it being expression of God. That's beautiful. That's really nice.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but if you think of it only in the human sense of things, then of course it's putting it above the source, I would say. Mm-hmm.
Right.
And it's a 24/7 job, the translations, right? I mean, we just seem to see all this matter around us, but it's a reminder constantly to remember what it really is, that it's spiritual.
Yeah, and that's why the Martha Wilcox book, Addresses, is so valuable, because she goes into that in her chapter on translations, scientific translations, and how it is to be done. And so is the book Spiritual Footsteps by Carpenter, because he gives many, many examples of how Mrs. Eddy did it in her home. And this helps teach us how to do it. It's very important to have that example as to how to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think it gets back to being grateful to God for providing the need for the time. But we need to grow out of the material need over time. And we should never ever be content with the matter that's been provided and forget the source, because the temptation is to worship the provision instead of worshiping the source, right? Yeah, to worship the gift instead of the giver. Thank you, Carol.
And, it's one thing that is impressed me in the Chosen to see how they're always thanking God. They'll just eat an apple and they thank God. When they leave their home, they do something like they kiss the door or something but some kind of a symbol that God has given it to them and God is taking care of them. We were taught that here too, when you leave your home, to know God has given it to you and care. So it's always turning your thought to God.
And that is why when we sit down for a meal, we say grace. We thank God for it. I mean, it's not just a ritual. It really means something.
Yeah,
I think a lot of this too has something to do with your state of thought, because I remember when I was studying carpenter quite a bit, there'd be times when there'd be like this sense of peace that would settle over her house at Pleasant View, and that would kind of tend to make the workers kind of go to sleep. So Mrs. Eddy would have to kind of go back and kind of stir them up to more activity. So that's kind of what I take away with this, is that you have to just you have to remain mentally active, even when materially or humanly things seem to be harmonious. Apparently that's just another phase of the belief. You have to work when it's raining, and you have to work when the sun's out, metaphorically. And I think when the sun is out, you tend to slow down, or that's what Carpenter was describing.
Well, most definitely.
Yeah, no, you're right. It has everything to do with your mental state of consciousness.
And you are more seeking God and when you're in trouble, so to speak, than when things are going well. It definitely puts people to sleep. Human harmony. And yes, Carpenter is wonderful in showing us examples of how Mrs. Eddy did that. She would not let people go to sleep. She was constantly stirring them up and keeping them in the right mind.
Yeah, I mean, didn't she say when they all kind of had just moved from Pleasant View to Chestnut Hill, one of her, I don't know if it was her first comment, but it was certainly early on, she mentioned, splendid misery. That's kind of it's an interesting comment, right? Because if you've been there, it's a beautiful house. Why would she say it's misery? I think it's partially that.
I think she said that upon arriving. She looked at that splendid misery. Well, she loved her Pleasant View home because of all that it represented to her. And it was, a country farmhouse that had been fixed up. But this thing was more like a fortress. And she didn't live very long there. And the cabal was, and I think she knew all that was going to fit there. So the cabal was already working. So, all right. Well, that was a good watching point for this week's topic on probation after death, because there are many things that we need to purify ourselves from, not just the more obvious of, I don't kill, I don't steal, I haven't committed adultery, so therefore I'm fine. There are many other ways that we are not obeying God to the fullest and giving him the full credit and obeying that wonderful first commandment. I looked up the word probation. It's trial, examination, any proceeding to ascertain truth. Any proceeding, and then to ascertain truth. Moral trial, the state of man in the present life, which he has the opportunity of proving his character and being qualified for a happier state. So we should always, as we talked about, examine yourself. Make sure you're doing the best you can. And every evening before you go to sleep, to go over things and ask God, have you done as best you can? I'd like to share, there's so many beautiful things in prose works, especially Unity of Good. I'm just going to share a bit of it on probation after death. Let's see, one is in Miscellaneous Writings, page 2, right at the beginning. Man's probation after death is the necessity of his immortality, for good dies not, and evil is self-destructive. Therefore, evil must be mortal and self-destroyed. If man should not progress after death, but should remain in error, he would inevitably self-annihilate. Those upon whom the second death hath no power are those who progress here and hereafter out of evil, their mortal element, and into good that is immortal, thus laying off the material beliefs that war against spirit and putting on the spiritual elements in divine science. And then in Unity of Good, there's a whole chapter called Is There No Death? And Mrs. Eddy says, because God is ever present, no boundary of time can separate us from him and the heaven of his presence. That's so beautiful. And because God is life, all life is eternal. A material sense of life robs God by declaring that he is that not he alone is life, but that something else also is life, thus affirming the existence and rulership of more gods than one. Back to the first commandment. Man has no underived power. That selfhood is false, which opposes itself to God, claims another father, and denies spiritual sonship. But as many as receive the knowledge of God and science must reflect in some degree the power of him who gave and giveth man dominion over all the earth. As soldiers of the cross, we must be brave, and let science declare the immortal status of man and deny the evidence of the material senses which testify that man dies. The sweet and sacred sense of the permanence of man's unity with his Maker can illumine our present being with the continual presence and power of good, opening wide the portal from death into life. And when this life shall appear, we shall be like him, and we shall go to the Father, not through death, but through life, not through error, but through truth. And that's so beautiful too, that sweet and sacred sense of the permanence of man's unity with his Maker can illumine our present being with a continual presence and power of good. And this is really what we all strive for and is our daily task to do.
Or at least we should strive for it.
Yeah.
But if we know what's good for ourselves.
So unity of good must be in your arsenal. So many wonderful things, and mark your book up so you have it to work with. And I've given it.
Mrs. Eddy call Unity of Good her masterpiece? I think she said something like that.
I believe that is true. I don't know where I read that, but yes.
Yeah.
In the Red Book, and I keep this in my Bible, this statement from the Red Book where Mrs. Eddy says, instead of being bound for the grave, we must know we are on the eternal road of life that has no sense of death. And this is how you have to picture yourself. You know, we don't. It's all around that you prepare for death. What's with that? So you have to actively counteract that. You are on the eternal road of life. I mean, you know, We're on the yellow brick road. Sing a happy song over it, where there is no death. And
that's not only if you've been educated to believe or to know that you are spiritual, like the scientific statement of being says.
yes.
But if you know all your life that you're a material being, it's just so opposite to what's true.
Yes. Thank you. And Mrs. Eddy says our probation time, it comes hourly, right? It's not some end thing. All the time, every day.
Well, and I think that's why she established this as a subject for a lesson. Because, here on earth, we're going through tests. We're being forced to learn things. We're having trials, and hopefully we're learning from them. And that seems to be the way of life here on earth. But there's this belief that once you leave this earth, whatever that means, that something changes. You either go to heaven and everything's hunky-dory, or you go to hell and everything's terrible, or you go to purgatory and you have no idea what's going on. And there are all these beliefs that something changes. And Mrs. Eddy is saying, no, nothing changes. Your life is eternal, and you keep going on having tests and trials and lessons to learn, just as you did when you were here. So we might as well learn as much as we can while we're here.
Absolutely. Why not? We live in the present always. Ultimately, there's no future, no past. It's only right now.
Reliable now.
The reliable now, yes.
Early workers said that,
and our experiences might change. She talks about we'll look out from the stars instead of looking at them. And so we might have larger experiences.
Well, hopefully we will, yes.
Yeah. Things will just get better. Better. Grand horizons
new pathways it talks about.
Yeah, new pathways, new. But we do know one thing, that God is a God of love. So whatever, it'll be wonderful, as it should be right now. And I love. Did you want to say something?
I was just thinking, this is my life. Every day we wake up, and sort of like when I was a young fella, I go out, and all of a sudden, every so often, there would be a bully that would come up to me and say, "You're going to do this," and I have to decide whether I was going to or I was going to stand up to him. And life these days, sometimes you hear in the news, it comes up like a bully says, "Are you going to believe this or you're not?"
Thank
and
you.
Then you have to whether you have to face it and say, "No, I'm not going to believe this," or decide to go to sleep. But life is one where you have to exert your spiritual strength, I guess.
Thank you very much. That is so true. I was just talking to Gary on the way over about how aggressive Era seems to be. It's very aggressive. It's loud. It's obnoxious. And when you tend, as a Christian, maybe not to be that way, you've got to learn to exert your strength. You don't have to be loud and obnoxious necessarily, but you got to learn to stand your ground, as you did, to any kind of a bully or a bullying thought that comes to you, whatever it tells you. That's why we stood firm during that pandemic when it was just raining down on us, everyone. And, they'll come up with something new now. So we just stay.
We'll be ready.
We'll be ready. Heads down, shields up. And I love in the lesson, it's very significant, citation 12, when it is learned the disease cannot destroy life, and that mortals are not saved from sin or sickness by death, this understanding will quicken into newness of life. It will master either a desire to die or a dread of the grave, and thus destroy the great fear that besets mortal existence. Now, that is so, because honestly, you're either one or the other. You either want to die because life is so miserable, or you're absolutely terrified of dying because you're enjoying your life, or whatever. But I mean, it's always one or the other, tempting. And God leads us not into temptation, but delivers us from sin, disease, and death. Believing these errors about life, that life can end, and that we're not immortals, no beginning and no ending. No. And this quickens you into newness of life. That's why, remember, every morning you're on the eternal road of life. There's no sense of death. We got a lot of work here on this earth to do, so we got to be here to do it.
And the newness of life is, we see people around us differently, don't we? When we understand this better. Mm-hmm. We treat people differently. We love people more and better. I mean, it's a wonderful newness that comes upon us when we realize that we are all on this path together forever. You can't get rid of people. You can't get rid of yourself.
No, that's right. That's right. You think you'll die and everything will change. You'll be happier, better. That Mr. So-and-so that you can't stand won't be there anymore. Well, you've got to overcome all of these false beliefs of life and matter. And Tom, yesterday at the Bible study, he quoted Martha Wilcox's saying something to the effect that every time you overcome disease, you've overcome death. Symptom of death.
Disease is a symptom of death.
And it's trying to get you back down, make you believe that God isn't all powerful, and accept something that's not true. And you see it chips away at you, so you accept that, and you have months of feeling horrible, and then you accept something else, and pretty soon you're ripe for who knows what. You got to stand, like Craig said, and let it bully you. Push back. No, I'm not having this.
Little foxes that spoil the vine.
The little foxes that spoil the vine.
Right. And remember, the devil, all these false beliefs, they are no more than a bully. They don't have power to do anything to you. The only power they might have is anything you give it to allow to frighten you.
Yeah. You accept. Now, this week, Carrie reminded me, and I'd read a poem by this man, Peter Henneker Heaton, and he was a Christian Scientist, and he'd been healed of a belief of
he was paralyzed.
Paralyzed, and it was a disease I think he had from childhood, but he faced it and began working in science with a practitioner, and it took 10 years, but he was healed of it. So I say this, not to be discouraged. It took 10 years. It said at some points he was so weak he couldn't even turn the pages of Science and Health. So he memorized half of it. Carrie said he read a page a day of Science and Health. And maybe in reading a page a day you can memorize it. But why not? I mean, why not? Mm-hmm. So he read half of it. And the one thing that characterized him was his joy. There's a book called Peter Henneker Heaton, Man of Joy. And we have said many times here, gratitude and joy are two essential, not maybe,
not optional.
No, essential ingredients to any healing. And I know in my own experience, because Era wants to make you think you're depressed, you're down, everything's wrong, you're miserable, you feel miserable, your life's miserable. And you got to push back on all that. You got to start somewhere. Might as well start now. So you start counting your blessings. You start expressing joy even though you don't feel like it. And that will help you get out of that false sense of a separation apart from God. And, pardon me?
No. At least you're not giving the error power if you do that.
If you do that. But I've seen it, and it's part of the sickness, if you will, to be depressed as well. Yeah, you're depressed, you feel horrible. It's all part of the whole same thing. You got to throw it off. No, no, no. And he did. And he went around, giving talks and lectures. And I have the book. There's a book, Peter Henniker Heaton, Man of Joy. And I'll read another one of his poems that I think is so beautiful, called Inhabiting Eternity. I hold the hand of him who holds the heavens in their place. I speak with him who quietly speaks with whirlwinds face to face. I light my seeing from the lamp that lit the sun and moon. I ground my thinking on the rock from which the rocks are hewn. I eat the bread of him whose bread gave multitudes to dine. The cup I drink is his whose cup holds water turned to wine. I have the speed of him whose speed no swiftness can forestall. I have the perfect rest of him who is alone and all. I reach the hand of him whose hand outreaches time and space. I dwell with him whose dwelling is the high and holy place. Now you can see how spiritual minded a person that he is, or was. I guess I could say was. He still is, though. Anyway, I haven't just read parts of the book, but it's a beautiful book and about a beautiful man who lived a very Christly life and who would not give in to this suggestion that he would be paralyzed all his life and die early and all of that. He would not do it. And another man I'm going to mention as well, because it reminds me of it, is you all, well, not all of you, but most of you knew this man called Jim Dybel. He did pass on a year or so ago, but he was a man of joy. Absolutely. It was many years ago, but he had some big thing happen to him. He was in the ambulance on the way to the hospital, and the person with him knew enough to call a practitioner, and the practitioner was speaking to him. They put the phone to his ear, and the practitioner told him it was not his time to go because they were saying he only had a few more hours to live. It wasn't his time. He had great work to do, and God would enable him to do it. And you know that story. He lived. They kept putting him in hospice, but he didn't need hospice. And he
Didn't take.
and he kept passing out signs and expressing such great joy and vigor. And he's lived many years more as an active member of our church. And even when that happened, he wasn't a spring chicken. He fought in World War II. So his life was like Hezekiah. It went on and on. But he was a man of joy. And if you think that he had life easy, well, yes, he fought in World War II. He had a son who, my understanding is, he never spoke of him to me, but my understanding is that he died of a drug overdose. He was just a teenager, early manhood. When he moved to Arizona from California, he was so excited. He and his wife, they were going to have this new home and all of this, and she passed on right before that happened. Did you ever hear one word of complaint or any sadness at all? I never, ever did. So please don't say he didn't have anything to be depressed about. He could have been very depressed.
Nobody has life easy.
Nobody does. We all have, every life, a little rain must fall.
That's true, though. I remember when he passed, I said, if we had patron saints, he would be the patron saint of joy.
Yes, you can remember him. Hello.
He was wonderful.
He was.
And he was all your shepherd.
Yeah, thank you.
He was
Thank
thanking
you,
God
shepherd.
for every good thing.
And a beautiful day today.
Yeah, beautiful day.
And he finished his course with joy.
He did. And does anyone remember how many times he read Science and Health? He told us.
Oh,
Like
30
77 or
Was it
something.
Oh, yeah,
that?
it was a lot.
It was a lot.
Yeah.
He kept a record. Just like Peter Henniker Heaton, he kept reading it, memorizing it, loving it, and he blessed everyone he came in contact with.
Gave it away all the time.
Yes.
Yeah,
To
oh
other
yes.
people.
Gave it away to everybody. He had a collection of Science and Health he gave away to people.
He's obeying God. This is what Mrs. I loved last night's watch. Mrs. Eddie talking about the science and health. That's what these people did.
Yes, giving it out, passing it out, sharing it. This is what gives you life. Now, if you have no reason to live, if you're just living for yourself or the next party you're going to go to or whatever, well, that's pretty depressing in itself. You've got to have a higher purpose to live. And if you do, God will keep you here for as long as necessary, and then you will graduate with joy. You will graduate with joy. So, and that's how it should be. But don't let anything get you down or depressed or ungrateful. You hold on to those. And if you do, you'll do well.
And when we accept our immortality, then we have to come to understand that we have always been, that there never was birth, because birth leads to death. And so it's a tough thing to, accept in the seeming world that we're in, but wow, it gives you freshness and vigor to think about that you're immortal, that you've always been and you always will be.
Yes.
And it's all about.
Thank you. Yes. Yeah, the Herbert Reiki immortality. I guess Dorothy Reiki one too, but yeah, no beginning. And I love it. And the Herbert Reiki he says, "Don't you remember, Mrs. So and so? Don't you remember being at the resurrection? And don't you remember?"
Yeah.
Seeing Lazarus come out of the tomb.
Yeah, don't you remember? That's why we must make these things very much alive and remember. Yes, we and also to be careful because everyone's so excited. The birth of a new baby, right? But a funeral. so remember, these are the things about these human so-called events we go to. You've really got to be on your mark. You can't let down. If you go to these baby showers and things, you got to know that you're not born into matter and you don't die out of it. And same thing, funerals. Same thing, weddings. All of these things, graduations. That the material world adores all these things, right? Oh my gosh, you make a big deal of it, and people don't understand. Maybe if you don't want to, but there's a reason why we don't want to.
Mm-hmm.
Not living or dying, but always in God's present moment, which goes on forever. So, all right, Chardell, would you share with what you had?
I really liked and working with Isaiah 25, and I really wanted to think about it more because this veil, and which is supposed to be spread over all nations, but he will swallow up death and victory, and the Lord God will wipe away tears from all faces, and the rebuke of his people shall take away from off all the earth, for the Lord hath spoken it. And it's beautiful. And then I thought, how is this done? And as I worked through it, and I read some things and commentaries, but this is what Herbert Euston says. And it's all about, for me, it became all about Christian Science. That's what's going to answer. That's the Lord speaking it. As a Christian Scientist, you know that there is no law of death. Why then bow down to the suggestion of such a law? The only law of death there is the law of life, which is the law of death to everything unlike itself. Herbert Eustace.
Thank you. Yes. Yeah, and the lesson says that that's all we'll lose is sin, disease, and death, because that's all that's not real.
Yeah.
Thank you. And Nancy, you spoke to that too.
Yes, thank you, Chardell. I really loved what you just read. I just found in Eliot's commentary that to cover the face was in the East a sign of mourning, and to destroy that covering was to overcome death, and so it became a symbol. The man whose face is thus covered cannot see the light, and the covering represents the veil which hinders them from knowing God. The final victory of God includes a triumph over ignorance and sorrow, as well as over sin and death. And then in Matthew Henry, he said the kind reception of repentant sinners is often in the New Testament likened to a feast. The guests invited are all people, Gentiles as well as Jews. And there is that in the gospel which strengthens and makes glad the heart, and is fit for those who are under convictions of sin and mourning. There is a veil spread over all nations, for all set in darkness, but this veil the Lord will destroy by the light of his gospel shining in the world, and the power of his Spirit opening men's eyes to receive it. He will raise those to spiritual life who were long dead in trespasses and sins, and Christ will himself in his resurrection triumph over death, and grief shall be banished, and there shall be perfect and endless joy. Those that mourn for sin shall be comforted. Those who suffer for Christ shall have consolation, but in the joys of heaven, and not short of them, will fully be brought to pass this saying, God shall wipe away all tears. The hope of this should now do away over sorrow all weeping that hinders sowing. Sometimes in this world, God does take away the reproach of his people from among men. However, it will be done fully at that great day. So let us patiently bear sorrow now, for both, and shame, for both will be done away shortly. And that was from Matthew Henry.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah. No matter how difficult the path may seem, remember, this too shall pass. The light is shining, and we'll see more and more unto the perfect day. And a few months ago, I believe it was Elizabeth, she sent me, it was about the mist, and this veil, mist, whatever you want to call it. And it was from a excerpt from the Bible for Every Man by Rosalie Moss. And she wrote that beautiful article, Spiritual Consultations. But it brings up that about what this mist tries to do. She has a summary of it, Rosalie Moss does, that it has the power to pull the wool over our eyes, to impose misconceptions on us, to believe there is sin, disease, and death, that it is a confusion of good and evil, that we are kept acutely aware of it through our 5 physical senses, that we have no adequate power of defense against it, that we should use material means to deal with it, though these bring only disillusion, that we need expect nothing but blood and sweat and tears. Well, that's great. That we might well give up hope and resign ourselves to it. Yet beneath the tones of the false record may forever be heard the true tones of the first account of creation, proclaiming with divine clarity against the temporary background of discords that the light of ideas is purely good, definite, powerful, ever-present, victorious, and altogether lovely. So we rise above the mist. Remember not to let it dim your eyesight or dim what truly is happening. The truth of your being. Okay, Linda.
I love the first line in Science and Health. It says, life is eternal. We should find this out and begin the demonstration thereof. Life and goodness are immortal. I just love that line, life and goodness are immortal. So I looked up immortal in the Webster's 1828 dictionary, and the definition was exempt from death, imperishable. And then it had some synonyms like abiding, ageless, continuing, enduring, eternal, everlasting, ongoing, perpetual, timeless, undying. And so then I would take each of the words and say that goodness is imperishable, goodness is timeless, and of course with life too. And I just found it just helped my understanding more to be more thoughtful about and deep and claim it and to kind of counter anything that would say good is limited or fragile or in the past or in the future. It's not. And I love that she said life and goodness are immortal. She put them together.
Thank you, because that was really one thing that stood out to me too, that same sentence. To really dwell on it is wonderful, and that definition is beautiful, what immortal is, and therefore what life is, and therefore what goodness is. And think on these things. It's very important that we do. So thank you for that. That was a good way that you used it, and that that we think goodness was the maybe the past, or maybe it'll be in the future. No, right here, right now.
Let's find this out, because it's a request. It takes a bit of study and
thank you.
And searching.
Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Takes that study and searching. And then this in Science and Health, the admission to oneself that man is God's own likeness sets man free to master the infinite idea. So, do you admit to yourself that you're God's own likeness? You have to admit it. You can't just say, I'm God's own likeness. I mean, there are books written by people who've done that and had terrible results. Because if you don't admit it, and admit means to grant entrance, to receive as true. So do you admit to yourself you're God's own likeness? I mean, do you really? Is it more than words? And if you do admit it, what does that mean to you? What does it mean to you, Craig?
It means that when I ask God and He tells me to do something, that one, I can do it, with its kindness or strength or I guess even understanding, and and it means that I can. Well, there's no separation. That's what really made me feel good. That like it says in the Bible, before you were in your mother's womb, God knew you. So that helped me to just feel like we were always together. Forget what you see, but we're always together. We always have been, always will be. That's all. I mean, I can just incrementally maybe do a little better every day, but at least that makes me grounded.
Thank you. What does it mean to you?
Nothing can stop me from being what God wills me to be, or doing what He wants me to do.
Shardy?
Oh, I think that I think about that I'm safe. We're safe. And when I know that I'm the image and likeness, and then I think of other people and kids knowing this, it's important that they know that they are the image and likeness of God who loves them. And this love will take us through no matter what.
Anyone else?
Well, to me, it says also is that God's nature is my nature. If I'm like God, then I'm like Him in every way.
Thank you. Yes. I take the definition of God that we had last week, I think. No, that's all that's true of God is true of you. And if it's not true of God, it's not true of you. And expound on all of that. Expound on it. And know that is the truth. But to really admit that you are, when you look in the mirror, do you see the image and likeness of God? Or are you looking at this, that, and the next thing? But
reflection.
yeah, the reflection, the expression, the joy, the beauty of God. I mean, it will change everything, and also it will put you in a state of immortality.
Can I say something to
Yes,
this?
go ahead, Siri.
It's so beautiful listening. I'm sitting with Uta in a square that's full of people, so I'm going to have to mute again. But this is so powerful. It gives me the understanding of why we meet and do this work together. It's like a spiritual bath.
Oh, good, thank you. Yes, yes. So, and of course, we know that heaven is not a locality, but a divine state of mind. So, right here, right now, we are in heaven, can be in heaven. If you were in that state of consciousness of life, truth, and love. So,
Because we can't say anything about ourselves except what we know of God. So our number one job while we're here is to learn as much about God as we can, and thereby get to know who we actually are.
yes, thank you.
All that he has is ours. All that I have is thine.
That's beautiful.
I think it helps you wash your robes. I know we have to go, but the golden text, it just stayed with me all week. You know, blessed are they that do his commandments, that they might have right to the tree of life. Well, I looked it up in other versions, and none of them say do his commandments. They all say, happy are they that wash their robes white. And so knowing this truth about us and others is one way that we, wash ourselves of this lie, the false evidence in front of us.
Right, and doing his commandments washes us, cleanses us, keeps us pure. All right, we're going to end now with, thank you, Tony. We're going to end with miscellaneous writings.
Questions and answers. Question. After the change called death takes place, do we meet those gone before? Or does life continue in thought only as in a dream? Man is not annihilated, nor does he lose his identity by passing through the belief called death. After the momentary belief of dying passes from mortal mind, this mind is still in a conscious state of existence. And the individual has but passed through a moment of extreme mortal fear to awaken with thoughts and being as material as before. Science and Health clearly states that spiritualization of thought is not attained by the death of the body, but by a conscious union with God. When we shall have passed the ordeal called death, or destroyed this last enemy, and shall have come upon the same plane of conscious existence with those gone before, then we shall be able to communicate with and to recognize them. If, before the change whereby we meet the dear departed, our life work proves to have been well done, we shall not have to repeat it, but our joys and means of advancing will be proportionately increased. The difference between a belief of material existence and the spiritual fact of life is that the former is a dream and unreal, while the latter is real and eternal. Only as we understand God and learn that good, not evil, lives and is immortal, that immortality exists only in spiritual perfection, shall we drop our false sense of life in sin or its sense material and recognize a better state of existence. Mary Baker Eddy.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank